Good morning. So we're talking about mobility. It's the hottest session at the conference. This arena is the area that could do more than possibly anything else to shape the future of the city. How we move people from one part of our cities to another. So we have a really interesting mix of perspectives on the panel today. And Robin, I want to start with a broad open question to you, in part because you have been in the process, you co-founded Zipcar and you ran it. You have been a transportation entrepreneur, and now you've been in this process of articulating principles, shared mobility principles that govern, that you think should govern how cities approach making decisions about mobility. Paint us a picture of heaven and hell. What does heaven look like? You know, from this transformative vantage point right now where we could shape the city. I don't know. I mean, it keeps moving closer, right? The autonomous vehicle future, it keeps moving shorter. We were talking about backstage. So let's say 10 years out. What does heaven look like? What does hell look like?
Heaven, I think we see pieces of heaven and hell already. We're living hell, part of hell, and part of heaven right now. So heaven looks like a city, I'm talking about dense urban cities, where I can do all of my short trips by walking, or we think of them as active modes now. I feel like there's a whole new category of vehicles we haven't talked about, these micro vehicles, so electric bike or regular bike and these scooters. I want to go back one step. My future is multimodal. When I walk out the front door, every single time I move, I get to choose the right option for that moment. Whereas today, people step out their front door and they just think car. In the future, I'll step out the front door and I'll have this suite of things. So 50% of my trips are short. They are today. They're less than 4 miles, and I'll be walking or cycling. If it's great weather, if it's not, I'll choose the mode. And 50% will be in motorized vehicles, which will be shared ones, meaning they're not being parked someplace for 96% of the time. I don't have to carry 17% of my income going towards paying for that car that I only use 5% of the time. So I will have a cheaper economic experience, a seamless and rational daily experience. And when people think, oh, that's really complicated, I just want you to think about when you eat food, how many different ways you consume, and it's not some giant drama, right? So the same thing will happen. And the hell piece, I do think we're living it right now, and the hell of the future will stem from the status quo hell of today, which means that we continue to underprice air pollution, and we've gone into our climate change disaster, which is already happening, that we continue with congestion because we don't address congestion by minimizing the number of people who by minimizing the cost of driving a single occupancy vehicle around, that we address the pickup and drop off and disaster that's happening at curbs and too cheap parking. So hell is continued status quo and worse. So we'll talk about self-driving cars in the end, but I guess the one piece to say is self-driving cars, because their marginal cost will be about 50 cents an hour to drive it. Everyone in this room is making decisions about whether to move their car based on how much it costs in gas and tolls and parking. Once you take your body out of that, and it's an electric autonomous vehicle, what would you not do? Where would you not move that car for 50 cents an hour? It doesn't even have to have your body in it. Go pick up whatever useless thing you wanted. And from a business perspective, brand new business models will be built on the back of moving a vehicle on our free streets at 50 cents an hour. So that is my hell version.
One of the big questions that I think is a very active current tension is who should be driving this decision making? Should technology, should companies be leading us into this bold new transportation future? Should cities and city planners be taking the lead? Within cities, which customers get prioritized? Should they be the wealthiest customers who have spending power in these markets, or should we try to prioritize equity for all residents? Scott, you have this really interesting vantage point as someone who's been in all the dots. You ran the Seattle Department of Transportation, SDOT. You you worked at DDOT in DC, you worked at CDOT in Chicago, and now you're the Chief Program Officer at Lime. And I'm curious, who do you think should be leading us into this bold new future?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's both the public and the private. I think, I like to think about, so the role of the public sector in my mind in this kind of world should be defining the desired outcome, right? And from a policy perspective, whether that's, what's your desired climate outcome, what's your desired, outcome for, serving all, and then, set the rules, set the framework, but then not dictate on how we get to that future. And then,
so give me an example of that from Seattle. What was your desired outcome that you set?
That's a good question. So, I think with our bike sharing program that we set out, we had an epic implosion of our dock-based bike share system. And so, but we still wanted to have bike share, so we went with a dockless program. And one of the things that when we started out, we kind of focused on what are the things that we don't want to have happen, right? And the biggest thing from my perspective was I didn't want to have parked bikes blocking sidewalks. And that was the biggest negative externality that I could see out there. And what I also wanted to protect against was I was uncertain about what the future of the industry was going to be. And so I didn't want to take the risk of having a bunch of bikes show up in town and then having companies go belly up and have city crews need to go and chase every single bike that's left around town. So we essentially just said, okay, we set some requirements on where folks could park. We had everybody put in a performance bond so that, like, if they went belly up, we had cash to pay our crews to go pick stuff up. And then we said, okay, you start with 500, next month you get 1,000, next month you get 2,000, next month 3, next month 4. And the idea with that structure was, one, define what we don't want to have happen, which is parking. 2, cover, sort of the worst of the worst of the potential outcomes. And then layer in a set of incentives that constantly was forcing every company to, service the city as best as they could, because without providing high quality service, they wouldn't be allowed to grow.
Got it. Now, as we talk about goals, Karina, you are running mobility and infrastructure for Pittsburgh. And this is a city that has a variety of different types of populations that you have to make decisions for. Space is the most scarce, precious, finite resource that a city has, and particularly our streets, and how you allocate space to different modes of transportation there's some zero-sumness about that. So how do you balance the needs of different residents of Pittsburgh as you make decisions about what modes you're allocating space to?
Right. Yeah. In Pittsburgh, our streets are typically, 30 feet wide from curb to curb, and most of them are at a 20% grade, so it makes things fairly interesting to allocate space for them. But what our end goals are when we're talking about goals for the city, we really talk about outcomes and what are the products of that. So we have 6 simple goals that we try and follow. I won't go through all of them, but they're things like every household in Pittsburgh should be able to get to fresh fruits and vegetables within 20 minutes, door to door, without the requirement of a private automobile. So how do we allocate our space? How do we design our streets for that outcome? Mode neutral, choice neutral, but every household should be able to achieve that. Every household should spend no more than 40% of their income on housing and transportation. Right now, the households in Pittsburgh spend about $15,000 a year on transportation when they can actually get an all-you-can-eat transit pass for $1,000 a year. The problem is the transit is not operating after 11 o'clock at night, or only coming once every 40 minutes. So we need to figure out how can we introduce other modes, how can we introduce other options into our streetscape that can be equally affordable to transit, but can fill that gap in time and space that they lack. We talk about enjoyment, that it should be enjoyable to walk and bike or take other active modes of transportation for the very short distance trips that Robin talks about. That should be our very first choice, is to walk when it's a mile or less. And so how do we design our streets for enjoyment, even as we're introducing all of these other mobility options, scooters and bikes and microtransit and autonomous vehicles? How does it contribute to the place of a city? And importantly, I think this week more than any, we want to make sure that our streets are places where people of different types of backgrounds, different types of experiences can come together in the commons of our city and really exchange and break down those barriers that we have between each other, that we can break down the strangeness that exists between us.
Yeah. Now, this kind of touches on the question of what will people want? As you're crafting goals, as all of our departments of transportation are crafting goals for their cities, they have to articulate these long-term visions for what the city will look like and what transportation will look like in the city. I'm curious, Robin, take autonomous vehicles. So let's talk about autonomous vehicles for a moment, because you've articulated these principles for them. I think for the ordinary person, the everyday person, their vision of this autonomous vehicle future is one in which if they've got their car, but it's autonomous. It's just, they don't have to drive it anymore. And one of the principles that you've articulated, number 10, autonomous vehicles, AVs, in dense urban areas should be operated only in shared fleets. Shared fleets, like possibly an Uber fleet or a Lyft fleet or a public fleet. That might be the most controversial of the 10. Just you Google around about it and you see headlines like, Uber wants to make it illegal to operate your own self-driving car in cities. Do you think that there's a risk, or how do we mitigate against the risk, that as we craft these long-term visions for our cities, that the visions that we create are in tension with how consumers see their own transportation options or want their own transportation options?
I think it's absolutely true that the person on the street, when they envision self-driving cars, is thinking, I take the thing that exists and I just replace it. And I want to say everyone in state houses and in national governments, that's what everyone is imagining. And we have to do better storytelling and better imagining so that people can picture this alternate future. So if I just go back to the Zipcar example, I didn't say, hey, wait up, you guys. I want 40 of you, 12 of you to share one car in your neighborhood. 40 of you are going to use it, and it's going to be better for the environment and cheaper for you. Like, no one would be doing that. Instead, you say, no, this is going to be cheaper, faster, better, and you're smarter. So when we think about this future, I think we do have to do better storytelling, better recognition that I feel like there's all these things about cities today that we don't like, that people are completely blind to. And there's this, in the transportation expert or community, we start to talk about car blindness, and that we have this complete blindness to the fact of how cars are taking up all of the sidewalks and the streets, and it's all dominated by that, so people cannot imagine something different. I think it has to do with storytelling and education and having more community involvement and engagement. Is what are your end goals, and let's explore and introduce the option of many more opportunities. And then finally, I would say, no matter what people say, when they are presented with an easier, cheaper, better thing to do, that's what they do. And I would just remind us all, when Sidecar, Lyft, and Uber started to say, hey, you can drive your own car as a taxi. People thought, you are out of your mind. I'm never going to get into that car with that stranger. Or, hey, you can rent your house out. I'm never going to do that. We all do it. Why? Because it's cheaper and easier and more convenient. So I don't think we can ask people to predict a future without any context, because we just imagine the status quo and marginal edge improvements.
Karina, I want to come back to you for a moment. Pittsburgh participated in an early pilot program of autonomous vehicles with Uber. And it was one of those programs. I think the experience there it kind of touched on many of the tensions that we have about who's driving the bus, for lack of a better metaphor. What So Mayor Peduto was very excited about this partnership in sort of signaling Pittsburgh as a city that is willing to explore and offer its residents an innovative, high-tech, driverless program. But the actual experience, Uber's relationship with the city seemed to deteriorate over time. What did you take away from that for how private actors and public actors should be working together?
I think what we took away from it is that it's all about partnership and openness and authentic collaboration. Autonomous vehicles are not new in Pittsburgh. We've actually had autonomous vehicles operating on our city streets since the late 80s. So, the fact that Uber would come there and demonstrate this new technology in our city, I think, we are a city that I think is used to this kind of technology, that we were open to this kind of technology, and we were welcoming of this kind of technology. It seemed very natural that the birthplace of sort of AI and robotics would also be the launching pad for public deployment of this. Where things, maybe eroded a bit was when the relationship became less open, where there was not the information sharing that we expected, that there was not the co-design or the co-collaboration. I think many companies like Lime and Lyft and others have also learned that coming to cities and doing to cities rather than with them is probably not the best business practice. That as we're all sort of figuring out this new mobility future together, that we do need to work on this appropriately, to really ask the question of what is the problem that we're solving for whom, how do we best serve that, how do we, as a private business, get what we need out of this demonstration, but how do we also serve the objectives and the goals of the cities that we're in, and that we now have a different relationship with Uber, a sort of a reset that we went through. We have great working relationships with the 5 different AV companies that operate in Pittsburgh, and it's one where we do feel that we are partners in this demonstration that they're making in our city, that this testing that is happening in a way that we are both solving the issues together. And working through this new evolution together. So it's a different relationship, and the partnership is really all important to us.
Yeah. So Scott, I asked you before about your experience running SDOT in Seattle, and now you're on the other side of the equation. You're working, you are the partner in this case at Lime. I don't want to get into the details of the legal dispute that's happening in San Francisco right now over scooter permitting with Lime and others, but it is one of those cases where speed to market, the speed at which these technologies are developing and at which new mobility options are being introduced to our streets is in tension with the pace of bureaucracy and regulation in cities. And so do cities need to move faster, or do companies need to respect their process?
Yeah, I candidly, I mean, this is probably not the best stage to say this on, sitting next to Karina as one of my colleagues, but I do think cities need to move faster. I think, and this is like a personal, deeply held belief, I think that, you look at, the challenges that we're facing, and like climate change to me is like an existential threat, and I don't think I'm unique in that, but you read that we have 10 years to turn it around, and I think a bias for action and just a need to move fast is pretty clear. I think that, what's unfortunate, and I understand, so I think what happens on the private side is that there's a lack of understanding about what are all of the public policy implications that cities need to be thinking about when private companies are coming in. So it's not just about, I'm under no illusions that we're not creating some negative externalities that are going to need to be addressed, and we want to work with regulators on how to do that. But I do feel like if you just break it down and take like public and private out of it, and you say, okay, we have a product in the e-scooter that our data and that we've collected internally from surveys and other city third-party research has shown is anywhere from 40 to 50% coming from trips that would have been made using either an Uber or a Lyft or a single occupant automobile. And you say, we have a product that we can roll out at scale, immediately across the country that will immediately drop the carbon footprint of our transportation system. And what's more is the big negative externality is that people are riding on sidewalks. You say, well, okay, why are they riding on sidewalks? They're not riding on they're riding on sidewalks because they don't feel safe in our streets. So we have this thing that can cut the carbon footprint of our cities, transportation system. And we have this other thing that is creating a whole new constituency of people that want safer streets, right? And will demand safer streets. We should be going all in as fast as humanly possible on that, right? Like cars redesigned American city streets over a 10-year period in the early 20th century. There wasn't a parking meter, there wasn't a traffic signal. All of those things got created because there was a new mode of transportation. So we've reinvented cities in a 10-year period, completely, continent-wide. And like we have a moment where, whether it's shared electric scooters or shared vehicles or, you know, microtransit, where we have the possibility to do that. And what's the big missing ingredient is like the ability to move quickly enough and like sort of the ability to get, you know, the public and the private sector to move at the same pace.
When we were getting mic'd up just now, Robin, you mentioned this. You talked about the way that at the beginning of the 20th century, we moved heaven and earth to upend cities here in America to make way for the car. And we did that at a pretty rapid pace, pretty quickly. We're living in, I mean, when I asked you the heaven and hell question, you said, you know, we're kind of in a current version of hell. And that's one of the legacies, I think, of that decision, to move to foster ways for cars. How do we avoid doing that now?
Avoid
creating a different hell by not anticipating the negative possibilities that might.
When I think about moving from e-scooters to cars, and actually e-scooters in this mix, we've had 100 years of experience with moving metal boxes on scarce streets. And whether the box has a driver or not, and whether the box is 8 square meters or 1 square meter, these are the same challenges that we've understood. And so if I look at it, I think we need to start charging per square meter. We need to start talking about what's the density of people inside those square meters. So I feel like we're not coming at this in a vacuum. It's the same challenge, moving the maximum number of people in these streets. And back to the shared mobility principles, number 3 is cities need to make efficient use of lanes, vehicles, and curbs. And if we focus on that, then we do deliver. When something like an e-scooter comes along, we say, wow, that's moving 1 person in 1 square meter. Let's prioritize that than you moving in your 8 square meters. And how we do that will, I think cities have options. They can change the use on the street, right? So corner, what do you say, building to building. So how much do sidewalks get? How much do micro vehicles get? How much do cars get? How much do stored cars get? How much do people in their wheelchairs get? And so we have to decide based on our social goals and how much throughput we need, what to do. And we have stopped paying attention to that. And if I can just do one anecdote, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was walking down the street thinking about these issues, and a man is walking towards me. A bicycle has just gone past him on the sidewalk, and he is irate about the bicycle on the sidewalk, hysterical. He's shouting to no one in the air, screaming, swearing. And as he approaches me, there's a crosswalk, and there's a car double parked in that crosswalk. He doesn't make a motion. He walks around that car through the crosswalk. And I think that is the world we're living in today. We are completely blind to the status quo of car consumption, car use, the costs, everything associated with it. That status quo, I never reevaluate it. And we're in this moment where we can reevaluate it. We can create a new cities that we want to live in. So this is the moment.
How do you think we get there quickly, Karina, and not leave, and respect equity, and not leave some of our citizens behind?
I mean, I think the first thing is to really understand what those needs are. We talked a little bit, backstage about that. We talk a lot about data. We talk a lot about, systems in the aggregate. But we very rarely really bring that down to the individual level. How does that mother with 3 children who has to drop them off at 3 different schools before she makes her, minimum wage job? how is she making that trip for her? How is the worker who's going out to the distribution facility on the third shift, out in the suburbs, how is he making that trip, making it on time, so that he can progress in his job and move up economic mobility through physical mobility? I think we really need to know those stories, know that human face, and keep laser focused on that, even while we're opening ourselves open to, throwing ourselves open to all of the other mobility options that scooters and microtransit and autonomous mobility provide, but keeping in mind who gets to benefit at the end.
Well, Karina, Scott, Robin, thank you so much this morning, and thanks to all of you.